Night, August 1944, northern France. The rain comes in sheets hammering on steel hoods and canvas roofs. Mud sprays up from spinning tires, blending with diesel fumes and the sharp tang of burnt rubber. Headlights are painted over. Only thin slits of light slice through the black. Somewhere ahead, another truck backfires, its echo swallowed by the storm. A convoy snakes along a narrow country road. Dozens of trucks, olive drab, dented, heavy with fuel and ammunition. Each one marked with a red ball stenciled on the side, glowing faintly under the wet moonlight. Inside one cab, a young driver grips the wheel with raw hands. He hasn't slept in 30 hours. The road is his enemy now, slick, endless, and alive with the sound of distant artillery. Above him, the faint growl of engines, German planes hunting. The driver presses on. He can't stop. Behind him lies Patton's entire Third Army running out of gas. The convoy keeps moving, because if it doesn't, the war might stop with it. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy are choked with wreckage, tanks, trucks, men, and supplies piled into an industrial tide. The greatest amphibious invasion in history has succeeded, but the cost is measured not only in lives, but in logistics. The Allies have clawed their way off the beaches. The hedgerows of Normandy are behind them, and now the war changes shape. Speed becomes the weapon. By August, General George S. Patton's Third Army has broken through the German lines at Avranches. His tanks, restless beasts of steel and fury, surge eastward toward the Seine. Every mile gained is another victory, and another logistical nightmare. Fuel, food, ammunition, tires, oil, spare parts. Each division consumes thousands of tons every single day. The front moves so fast that the established supply chain, built for a slow, methodical advance, collapses under its own weight. The Allies' solution had been ports and pipelines. But Cherbourg is wrecked. Le Havre still burns. The Mulberry harbors at Normandy, battered by storms, barely function. The roads are clogged with traffic. Railways are twisted ruins. Bridges lie in rivers shattered by retreating German engineers. For every tank that rolls east, 10 trucks must follow behind. But there aren't enough trucks, and those that exist crawl along cratered roads, their drivers dodging snipers, wreckage, and exhaustion. By late August, Patton's fuel reserves are nearly gone. His army, the very spearhead of the Allied advance, risks grinding to a halt in the French countryside. "My men can eat their belts," he famously growls, "but my tanks have got to have gas." At Chef, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, logisticians scramble for answers. How do you feed an army moving faster than your own supply lines? Colonel Lauren Albert Ayers and General John C. H. Lee, both logistics officers under General Dwight D. Eisenhower's command, are tasked with the impossible. Move thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition over 300 miles of broken French roads, without ports, pipelines, or rails. The situation is so dire that some suggest halting Patton's advance altogether. But Eisenhower knows momentum is everything. The German army is in retreat, wounded, chaotic, but not destroyed. Stop now and the enemy will regroup behind the Siegfried Line. And so, in a series of frantic meetings in late August 1944, an idea takes shape. Not elegant, not strategic, but desperate. If the supplies can't come by rail or port, they will come by road, convoys, endless lines of trucks driving day and night in one direction, hauling fuel, food, and ammunition straight from the Normandy depots to the front lines. It sounds insane. The roads are too narrow, the trucks too few, the drivers too exhausted, but it's the only option left. They name the project after the red disc used in American railways to mark priority cargo, Red Ball. And so, on August 25, 1944, the first trucks roll out from St. Lo, heading toward Chartres and beyond. Their mission: keep Patton's army alive. Within days, it becomes clear this is no ordinary convoy. It's a living artery of the Allied advance. Drivers work around the clock. Mechanics patch vehicles on the roadside. Fuel is siphoned from one truck to another mid-route. The men behind the wheel? Mostly young, mostly inexperienced, and overwhelmingly, African-American soldiers from segregated trucking battalions. Men who had been told they wouldn't see the front. Now they are the front. They drive through darkness, mud, and strafing runs, hauling the lifeblood of an army that can't afford to stop. The system works, but only barely. The first weeks are chaos. Congestion, confusion, breakdowns. Commanders fear collapse. Then one sergeant, somewhere along that endless road, proposes a method so radical it borders on madness, a convoy rhythm that would change the entire system. But before that method could be tested, the Red Ball Express itself had to be built, organized, and hardened into one of the most efficient supply systems ever seen in modern war. And that story, the creation of the Red Ball, begins with a map, a few thousand trucks, and a promise made under fire. The order came on August 25, 1944. The Red Ball Express is to operate immediately. There was no time for preparation. No time for experiments. The Allied front was moving too fast, and the only way to keep it supplied was to invent a logistics miracle overnight. In a single day, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps carved out a 700-mile highway system across northern France. Two main routes were designated, one outbound, one inbound, forming a great loop from the Normandy beach depots to the advancing front lines near Chartres, Dreux, and Reims. The rules were simple. The outbound route was one way only. No vehicle could stop, turn back, or overtake unless ordered. The inbound road, parallel and equally strict, carried the empty trucks back for refueling and reloading. Every stretch of road was guarded by military police. No civilian traffic allowed. No exceptions. Convoys were to run 24 hours a day, in rain, darkness, or enemy fire. Every truck was to bear the insignia of a red ball, a circle painted on the hood or bumper, the mark of priority passage. It was a visual command. Get out of the way, this road belongs to the Red Ball. Behind the idea stood a handful of men who understood that logistics wins wars. Among them Brigadier General Ewart G. Planck and Colonel Laurent Ayres, who coordinated the first convoys from depots in Saint-Lô and Isigny. They had studied the American railway system, where Red Ball indicated the fastest freight trains, express cargo that had to move without delay. Now they were turning that same concept loose on the roads of France. Within 48 hours, over 6,000 vehicles were mobilized. Soon, that number would triple. Most were 2 ton GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, simple, durable machines that became the backbone of Allied supply. Some hauled jerry cans of gasoline, others crates of rations or artillery shells stacked high beneath canvas tarps. The drivers were drawn from every corner of the Allied forces, but over 75% came from African-American truck companies, men from the 514th, 515th, 483rd, and others. Many had never driven outside a base camp. Now they were expected to pilot heavily loaded trucks across mined roads, through bombed-out towns and under the constant threat of Luftwaffe strafing runs. The organization was crude, but effective. Convoys of 20 to 30 trucks departed every few minutes, escorted by jeeps or armored cars. Each route was dotted with refueling points, repair depots, and rest stations, though few drivers had the luxury of rest. A single round trip could take 40 hours or more, and drivers often completed multiple runs a week. The roads themselves were treacherous. France's narrow rural lanes, designed for farm carts, now carried columns of military trucks stretching as far as the eye could see. Dust, rain, and mud turned every mile into a test of endurance. Brakes burned out, engines overheated, and tires shredded under the constant strain. Mechanics worked in ditches and fields, patching trucks with salvaged parts. Discipline was everything. Drivers who stopped without cause risked court-martial. Military police stood at intersections, directing endless streams of traffic with white gloves and whistle blasts. Roadside signs in bold letters warned, "Keep 'em rolling." Fuel was measured like gold. Every drop had to reach the front. Tankers and jerry cans were guarded like treasure. Drivers learned to sleep in their seats, eat on the move, and navigate by instinct through blackout conditions. Despite the hardship, morale grew. The Red Ball Express became a symbol, a brotherhood of motion. The men knew the stakes. If they failed, Patton's advance would die on the road. Within weeks, the system began to show results. By early September 1944, Red Ball convoys were delivering up to 12,000 tons of supplies daily, an astonishing figure considering the chaos. Yet for all its success, the system strained under pressure. Trucks broke faster than they could be repaired. Depots ran low on parts. Fuel sometimes had to be siphoned from one convoy to feed another. Still, the lifeline held. But by mid-September, as the front stretched deeper into France. Even the Red Ball's efficiency was tested. The round trips grew longer. The strain on drivers reached breaking point. Losses, through breakdowns, attacks, or simple exhaustion, mounted fast. Commanders demanded a new solution, a way to make the convoys faster, safer, and more reliable. It was then, amid the fatigue and chaos, that one trucker proposed a method so unconventional that even his superiors called it ridiculous. Yet that ridiculous idea would soon slash convoy losses by more than 90%. And cement the Red Ball Express as one of the greatest logistical achievements of the Second World War. Inside every truck of the Red Ball Express sat a story. Most drivers were barely 20 years old. Many had never left the United States before the war. They came from farms, factories, and small towns, men who had enlisted or been drafted into service units because of the color of their skin or the needs of the army. Their trucks were their homes. They slept sitting upright, helmets slumped over steering wheels. Their meals were cold rations eaten one-handed. In heavy rain, canvas roofs leaked. In the heat, the engine burned their legs. They drove through nights that never seemed to end, with blackout curtains over the headlamps, following only the red glow of the truck ahead. Convoys stretched for miles, sometimes 200, even 300 vehicles long, crawling over bombed bridges and through villages still smoldering from battle. They faced ambushes and Luftwaffe strafing runs. On some routes, German snipers harassed the roads, firing from tree lines. More than once, drivers returned to base with bullet holes stitched through their doors. Sleep deprivation was constant. Drivers learned to keep one eye on the road, one on the horizon. Those who stopped for even a moment risked being rear-ended or lost in the stream of traffic. And yet, there was pride. We kept 'em rolling, one veteran recalled decades later. We didn't stop for nothing. That was our job. The Red Ball drivers were not combat soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were frontline men all the same. Their courage was quiet, measured in miles instead of medals. They called themselves truck warriors. Because every trip forward was a fight against exhaustion, machinery, and fear. The brilliance of the Red Ball Express wasn't just manpower, it was rhythm. Each convoy was a living organism, designed for motion. The system operated on a principle that every logistics officer now takes for granted: uninterrupted flow. Convoys left depots every 15 to 30 minutes. Each group carried specific loads, fuel, rations, ammunition, and followed timed schedules. Trucks were numbered, routes color-coded, and dispatch orders strict. There were no stops, no detours. Every truck had one job: move forward until it reached its destination. The outbound and return roads were rigidly separated. Drivers who broke formation or used the wrong lane faced discipline. Military police controlled intersections with surgical precision, preventing bottlenecks. Even the speed was standardized, 25 miles per hour. No more, no less. It may sound simple, but it was revolutionary. Traditional military convoys often halted for rest or reorganization, but the Red Ball system turned supply into a conveyor belt, a relentless loop. When weather hit or bridges failed, engineers rebuilt routes within hours. Temporary depots were established along the roads, primitive gas stations, repair huts, and traffic control points, where MPs waved the lifeline forward. The effect was astonishing. Where once supplies took 5 days to reach the front, they now arrived in a single night. The Red Ball Express was not an elegant plan, but a brutal one. It demanded total obedience, total sacrifice. It transformed chaos into choreography, and at its heart were the drivers who made that rhythm possible, the human pistons of a machine that never stopped moving. Behind every roaring engine stood leadership, impatient, relentless, and unyielding. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood that logistics was the skeleton of victory. His staff worked around the clock to track tonnage, fuel usage, and delivery routes, but it was his field commanders, like George S. Patton, who drove the urgency. Patton's Third Army devoured supplies faster than any formation in Europe. He demanded mobility above all else. "My men can't fight without gasoline," he said, "and I can't win without speed." When fuel convoys fell behind, Patton personally visited the depots shouting for answers, threatening to drive the trucks myself. His fury terrified officers, but it inspired action. Under him, Logistics wasn't just support, and it was strategy. General John C. H. Lee, head of the Services of Supply, became the unsung architect of the Red Ball system. A perfectionist and master organizer, Lee insisted on order in the chaos. His doctrine was blunt. Get the supplies there, no matter what it takes. Colonel Loren Ayres and Brigadier General Ewart Plank executed those orders with precision, assigning routes, establishing checkpoints, and mobilizing entire trucking battalions within days. These men operated in what soldiers called the Shadow War, a war of fuel gauges, schedules, and tonnage reports. They understood that without trucks, tanks were useless. Without fuel, victories were temporary. But leadership also meant improvisation. When convoys bogged down in rain, commanders authorized bypasses through farm fields. When trucks ran out of spare parts, maintenance crews scavenged wrecks for components. Every obstacle had one answer: find a way. This leadership culture, pragmatic, ruthless, adaptive, turned a logistical gamble into a sustained artery of power. And yet, even the best leaders couldn't solve the greatest vulnerability of the Red Ball Express: the trucks themselves. The Red Ball Express ran on one of the most remarkable vehicles of the war, the GMC CCKW-2 1- and 2-ton truck, affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't roar like a tank or soar like a fighter plane, but it was the machine that made victory possible. Powered by a 6-cylinder engine and capable of carrying 5,000 pounds of cargo, the CCKW was designed for durability. It could ford rivers, climb gradients, and roll over the ruins of bridges. But in France, these trucks were pushed far beyond their limits. They ran 20 hours a day. Tires blew. Engines seized. Transmissions cracked. Dust clogged filters and destroyed bearings. Maintenance crews set up roadside workshops. Makeshift pits dug in mud, lit by kerosene lamps. Spare parts were so scarce that mechanics stripped abandoned vehicles to keep others running. Some drivers welded armor plates to their doors to fend off sniper fire. Others installed auxiliary fuel tanks to extend range. The technology of the Red Ball Express was less about innovation and more about endurance. Trucks became living things, each one unique, each one temperamental. Drivers learned to listen to every rattle, every sputter, like a doctor diagnosing a patient. The convoy's rhythm was mechanical, but its survival depended on the hands that kept the machines alive. And that mechanical heartbeat, thousands of engines, drumming across France, it became the sound of Allied momentum itself. But, for all the brilliance of the system, it faced one growing threat: exhaustion, both human and mechanical. The more the front advanced, the longer the routes became, and the higher the losses climbed. It was at this breaking point that one trucker's unorthodox method would change everything. The roads of northern France were not safe. Every convoy that rumbled east carried not only supplies but risk. The German army, though broken and retreating, was far from finished. Behind their lines, snipers, saboteurs, and stray Luftwaffe fighters hunted anything that moved. At dawn, the Red Ball trucks were easy targets. Convoys snaked across open country, their dust trails visible for miles. Pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 and other Luftwaffe units flew low, strafing the columns with 20mm cannon fire. Drivers dove into ditches, returned to burning trucks, and climbed back in. The orders were simple: deliver or die trying. German infiltrators in captured uniforms attempted to sow chaos, redirecting convoys or spreading false road instructions. In some regions, French civilians warned truckers of traps ahead. Bridges were mined, culverts sabotaged. Every delivery was an act of defiance. But the Red Ball Express adapted fast. Convoys began traveling in tight formations, easier to defend, harder to ambush. Anti-aircraft half-tracks took position near key intersections. Military police patrolled every stretch, radioing warnings of Luftwaffe movement. And still, the trucks rolled. The Germans soon realized that no matter how many they destroyed, the flow never stopped. For every truck lost, another followed behind it. The Red Ball Express became a symbol not just of Allied logistics, but of Allied inevitability. It was the sound the enemy learned to fear, the low, endless thunder of engines in the distance. Beneath the roar of engines, another conflict burned quietly, one not fought with bullets, but with dignity. The Red Ball Express was built, driven, and maintained primarily by African American soldiers. Over 75% of its workforce came from segregated trucking companies. Men who wore the same uniform, swore the same oath, but were treated as second class even as they carried the Army's lifeline. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still racially divided. Black soldiers were often restricted to labor or service roles, rarely trusted with combat or command. Many officers doubted their discipline, their skill, even their courage, but the Red Ball Express shattered those illusions. On the road, there were no ranks, no race lines, only drivers, mechanics, and the mission. These men faced every danger the front could throw at them, often under worse conditions and with fewer resources than their white counterparts. They drove when others slept. They repaired when others rested. Sergeant Eddie Lou Jones of the 514th Truck Company once recalled, "They said we couldn't handle it. We showed them we could handle anything." Stories spread through the ranks of black drivers rescuing wounded comrades under fire, of mechanics rebuilding entire engines in a night, of convoys that reached the front when everyone said it was impossible. Word of their performance reached Eisenhower himself. In later reports, the Supreme Commander credited the Red Ball Express, and specifically its black drivers, with sustaining the Allied drive across France. For many of these men, it was the first time their work was recognized as vital to victory. When the convoys finally slowed, the men returned home to a nation that still refused them equality, but their legacy endured, not only in the miles they drove, but in the myth they created, that courage is colorblind, and discipline is the purest measure of a soldier. To drive in the Red Ball Express was to exist in a different kind of war, one fought in silence, repetition, and fatigue. Every day began with the same ritual. Check tires, fuel up, load cargo, fall in line, then drive. Drive until the road blurred. Drive until the sound of the engine was all that existed. Men talked to their trucks, sang to them, cursed them. They counted miles like prisoners count walls. Some painted names or slogans on their hoods. Mississippi Mule, Patton's Baby, Black Diamond. They laughed when they could. Some convoys carried phonographs. Others joked that the Red Ball Express ran on coffee and nerves. But the strain was constant. Crashes were frequent. Fatigue was the deadliest enemy. One driver later said, "You'd see a truck drift off the road, just drift, like it was falling asleep." And it was. The man inside was gone. There were no medals for these men, no glory, no headlines. Only the rhythm of miles and the knowledge that each gallon delivered meant another tank that could fight. Another division that could live. The Red Ball Express became a test of the human limit, how long a man could drive, how much pressure he could endure, and how far sheer willpower could carry him by early September 1944. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a convoy. It was a symbol. It represented the beating heart of the Allied war machine, the industrial spirit of America in motion. Reporters called it the Miracle Highway. Soldiers at the front called it our guardian angel. It was proof that war wasn't only won in the skies or on the beaches, but in the mud, behind the wheel with grease on your hands and no sleep in your eyes. The image of those convoys, endless lines of trucks under the French moon, red balls glowing on their hoods wing, became an icon of determination. But symbols fade. The men who made it work rarely spoke of it afterward. They returned home, blended into post-war life, their story largely forgotten. Yet for a few crucial months in 1944, the Red Ball Express was everything: muscle, motion, and momentum. And at its center stood one driver's radical idea, a method so unorthodox that even his superiors doubted it, until the numbers proved them wrong. The convoy system had reached its limit. Breakdowns mounted, losses climbed, morale thinned. Then came the moment, a single adjustment, a single change in rhythm, that would slash those losses by over 90%. The turning point was here. By the second week of September 1944, the Red Ball Express was stretched to its breaking point. The Allied advance had outpaced every expectation. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Marne and was pressing toward the Moselle River, deep into eastern France. The front lines were now over 300 miles from the Normandy supply depots. The roads, once muddy tracks, were now scarred trenches of ruts and wrecks. Engines blew, tires shredded. Fuel was running low even for the trucks carrying fuel. In just 3 weeks, over 1,500 vehicles had been lost, not to the enemy, but to fatigue, breakdown, and chaos. Convoys jammed at crossroads, blocking one another for hours. The lifeline that had once pulsed smoothly now sputtered like a dying heart. Commanders gathered in emergency meetings near Chartres, desperate for a solution. They needed to move 10,000 tons of supplies daily, and they were barely managing half that. Among the truckers, frustration simmered. Men were sleeping 4 hours a night, running their engines until they seized, risking court-martial if they stopped. Then came a suggestion, one so absurd it bordered on madness. The story has several versions, but most trace it to a senior driver, possibly from the 5 and 14th Truck Company, a veteran who'd seen too many convoys stall because exhausted men simply couldn't go on. His proposal, delivered to his commanding officer, was simple. Don't stop the trucks. Stop the drivers. Instead of assigning each truck to one driver for the entire route, a system that guaranteed exhaustion, he proposed rolling crews. Each convoy would operate as a continuous loop. Trucks would never stop moving. Drivers would be rotated at designated points, rest stations, depots, or checkpoints, like pit crews in a race. When one driver's shift ended, another would take his seat, and the truck would keep rolling. It was, in effect, turning the convoy into a perpetual motion system. When the idea reached headquarters, it was met with skepticism, even laughter. Commanders called it ridiculous. The roads were too narrow, the manpower too thin, the coordination too complex, but desperation has a way of silencing doubt. Colonel Lauren Ayres approved a limited trial, a single convoy, of fuel trucks running from St. Lo to Chartres, using the rotation method. The result was immediate, where ordinary convoys took 24 hours to complete a run. The rolling convoy finished in 14. There were fewer breakdowns, fewer accidents, no delays, and because the trucks were constantly moving, they became harder targets for Luftwaffe strafing. The success spread like wildfire. Within days, the entire Red Ball Express adopted the system. Rest stations were established along the route. Nothing fancy, just tents, cots, and mess stations where drivers could sleep or eat before rejoining a convoy heading the opposite direction. Each truck was logged, timed, and handed from one driver to the next like a relay baton. It was chaotic at first. Drivers overshot their stations, schedules clashed, and communication lines were overwhelmed. But soon discipline reasserted itself. The road became a rhythm again, a breathing, moving artery. Convoys that once crept along now thundered forward in perfect cadence. The ridiculous method became gospel, and the results? Astounding. Supply losses from accidents, confusion, and fatigue dropped by over 90%. Delivery speed increased by almost half. The number of tons moved per day surged past 12,000, sometimes even reaching $14,000. Patton's tanks rolled again. The general, upon hearing of the system's success, famously remarked, "My men can fight because those drivers deliver." From that moment, the Red Ball Express was no longer just a stopgap. It was the model for Allied logistics. Every truck, every driver, every gallon of fuel became part of a ceaseless motion that kept the war alive. One idea, dismissed as absurd, had turned exhaustion into momentum. But the greatest test was still ahead. As September turned to October, the weather worsened. The roads froze. German resistance stiffened. And once more, the Red Ball Express would find itself racing against the limits of man and machine. Late September 1944, France was drenched again. The rains returned, cold, relentless, and merciless. The roads that had once been dirt and dust turned back into rivers of mud. Trucks sank to their axles. Tires spun uselessly, and yet the convoys never stopped. The Red Ball Express was now running 24 hours a day every day. Over 6,000 trucks thundered across France in continuous motion, a highway of sound, diesel, and discipline. Each truck carried the heartbeat of an army. 5-gallon jerry cans stacked like bricks of gold, crates of ammunition sealed with grease paper, and barrels of gasoline that reeked of both life and death. Drivers rotated in and out at checkpoints, rough posts made of sandbags and wooden signs scrawled with chalk. Coffee was thick, black, and bitter. Rest came in stolen minutes. One veteran later said, "You didn't sleep on duty. You slept through duty." The trucks didn't stop, ever. The rolling convoy method had transformed the system into a perpetual cycle. At any given hour, hundreds of trucks were being unloaded near the front while hundreds more were reloading at depots miles away. The road never went silent. Military police reported that the route could be followed by sound alone. A low, constant growl echoing through the countryside mile after mile, hour after hour. But the strain was immense. Trucks that had already run thousands of miles without major service began to fall apart. Gearboxes failed, engines overheated, brakes disintegrated on long downhill grades. Maintenance crews worked in rain-soaked fields, their wrenches numb from the cold. Despite it all, the numbers kept rising. In the first week of October, Red Ball convoys delivered over 135,000 tons of supplies to the front, enough to fuel Patton's armor, feed entire divisions, and keep artillery firing through the wet gloom. Still, the drivers knew that each mile brought them closer to the limit. Enemy air attacks intensified. Though the Luftwaffe was dwindling, isolated squadrons launched desperate strikes on the convoys, diving out of cloud cover to rake the roads with fire. Drivers learned to swerve without thinking, to read the whistle of bullets before they hit, and then there was fatigue, the silent enemy. Even with the rotation system, some men refused rest. They stayed with their trucks, believing no one else could drive them right. Some hadn't been off the line in weeks. One night near Argentan, a truck rolled silently off the road and into a ditch. The driver was found still upright, hands on the wheel, dead asleep. By early October, engineers had begun widening key stretches of road, paving with crushed stone to handle the ceaseless traffic. Entire towns were turned into rest and repair centers. French civilians, astonished by the scale of it all, watched convoys pass for hours, the endless train of American steel rolling east toward the front. At the spear's edge, Patton's men could see the difference. Tanks that would have gone dry roared back to life. Artillery fired without pause. Fuel dumps near Nancy and Metz overflowed. The ridiculous system, mocked only weeks before, had become the spine of Allied progress. And then came its most symbolic moment. October 12, 1944. After weeks of constant rolling, a record was set. A single day's delivery of 12,342 tons of supplies, the largest overland transport in modern warfare at that time. General Eisenhower's staff recorded it simply. The Red Ball Express has delivered the impossible, but the men on the ground didn't see numbers. They saw the road, a wet, endless, and unforgiving. They saw the faces of fellow drivers asleep over coffee tins, mechanics limping back from breakdowns, MPs waving the endless stream of headlights through the night. They didn't think of records or victories. They thought only of keeping the wheels turning. Because stopping was unthinkable, the Red Ball Express had become something beyond logistics. It was a symbol of momentum itself, proof that human will, when harnessed to machinery and necessity, could become unstoppable. By November, as Allied forces reached the German border, the convoys began to slow. New ports opened. Railways were rebuilt. The Red Ball Express, the born of desperation, could finally rest. Its work was done. The front was supplied, the army fueled, and the war moving toward its final act. But for the men who drove it, the sound of those engines would never fade. It was the sound of duty, and of something close to destiny. By late November 1944, the Red Ball Express, once the roaring artery of Patton's Third Army, began to thin. The advance had slowed near the German frontier. Fuel and ammunition now came through the ports of Antwerp and Le Havre, newly captured and reactivated. The railway lines, rebuilt by Allied engineers, took over much of the heavy transport, and so, mile by mile, the convoys stopped. The endless chains of trucks that had defined the late summer of 1944 began parking one by one in French fields, their engines finally cooling. Mechanics stood in the quiet, listening to the ticking of metal, the strange stillness after months of noise. But the impact of what had been done was already written in numbers. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations. Nearly 75% of all supplies consumed by U.S. ground forces in northern France were carried by those convoys. More than 23,000 trucks and 6,000 trailers were part of the network. At its peak, a truck departed every 90 seconds, day and night. The success had come at a cost. Mechanical breakdowns had consumed nearly half the fleet. Tires, filters, and clutches were replaced faster than they could be shipped. More than 300 drivers were killed, not in combat but in accidents, exhaustion, and air attacks. Thousands more were injured. For many soldiers, the Red Ball Express was their first experience of war, and for most, it was as grueling as any battle. Roughly 75% of all Red Ball drivers were African American, men of segregated service units, often denied combat roles but trusted with one of the most vital operations of the war. Their contribution was immense. In interviews decades later, many recalled how the mission gave them pride. Not through recognition, which was slow to come, but through purpose. One veteran, remembering the unbroken nights, said, "We didn't have medals. We had the road, and the road was everything." The convoy system they perfected, the rotating crew, the non-stop operation, the decentralized checkpoints he did, became a blueprint for future military logistics. When the Red Ball Express was officially disbanded on November 16, 1944, its principles didn't die. They spread new express routes, White Ball, Green Diamond, XYZ Convoy, and took over, modeled on its efficiency. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps studied the methods in detail, documenting every improvement, every failure, every innovation born of necessity. Even Eisenhower's post-war report cited the Red Ball Express as a decisive factor in sustaining offensive operations, and behind every statistic was that one idea, the ridiculous notion that trucks should never stop. Only drivers. It had begun as a desperate gamble. It ended as doctrine. The war in Europe still had months to go. The Battle of the Bulge was only weeks away. But the logistical lessons learned from those convoys would define Allied mobility. For the rest of the campaign, Patton's army could move fast because someone, somewhere, was willing to drive faster, longer and harder than logic allowed. The Red Ball Express proved that the true front line wasn't just at the guns, it was on the road, and those roads still carried the marks of their passage: deep ruts, frozen in the mud, broken crates, burnt-out engines, and the faint smell of oil that lingered long after the trucks had gone. But the war machine rolled on, and with it, the legacy of a system born from chaos, perfected by willpower, and remembered by the sound of 1,000 engines that refused to rest. When the Red Ball Express finally shut down, it wasn't marked by ceremony or fanfare. There were no parades, no speeches. Just a few words on an operations sheet. Service discontinued. Mission complete. But for the men who had lived on the road, that single line meant something deeper. An ending, yes, but also a quiet vindication. Their mission had seemed impossible. Keeping a modern army supplied entirely by trucks over hundreds of miles of wrecked French countryside had defied every logistic theory of the time. And yet they had done it. They had outrun their depots, rebuilt their own checkpoints, repaired their trucks in ditches, and kept an army moving faster than its own planners thought possible. For General Eisenhower, it was proof of something profound. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that mobility, not numbers, not even firepower, was now the essence of modern war. It also revealed a truth about the American war effort that rarely made headlines. It was built not just on strategy or technology, but on human endurance. Thousands of truckers, many barely out of training, had operated on instinct, navigating unmarked roads, pushing through storms, and finding their way by the glow of distant artillery. They'd turned a logistical nightmare into a living network of trust and timing. When reporters later asked commanders what made the difference, the answers were blunt. "Gasoline and guts," one colonel said. Mostly guts. But there was another story running beneath the surface, one that would echo long after the war ended. For the African American drivers who made up the majority of the Red Ball Express, the road was more than a mission. It was a stage on which they proved what many in their own army had doubted: their skill, courage, and discipline. In 1944, the U.S. military was still segregated. Black soldiers were often restricted to support roles, denied combat positions or leadership opportunities. Yet on those French roads, under fire and exhaustion, they became the lifeline of an entire army. When Patton later praised the Red Ball drivers, he didn't mention race. He didn't have to. The results spoke louder than any order. After the war, many veterans of the Express returned home to a country still divided, still slow to recognize them. But in time, their record became impossible to ignore. Historians would later call the Red Ball Express one of the great logistical feats in military history, and one of the quiet foundations for the eventual desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. General Eisenhower's later push for the integration of supply and transport units drew directly from the success of these mixed operations. The road had changed more than the war. It had begun to change the Army itself, and beyond the military, the lessons endured. The system of rotating drivers, mobile maintenance, and continuous movement became standard in post-war logistics. The U.S. highway system, proposed by Eisenhower a decade later, drew partly from his wartime experiences with the Red Ball routes, roads that had shown what a nation could achieve when its arteries stayed open. In France, the old convoy paths were slowly reclaimed by grass and time. Farmers plowed over the ruts. Children played on the same roads where convoys once thundered. But in the towns along the route, Alençon, Chartres, Dreux, the people remembered. They remembered the endless stream of olive-drab trucks, the smell of gasoline, the men who waved, shouted, and never seemed to stop. Decades later, monuments would rise along those same roads. A red circle on a white sign, Le Red Ball Express, marking where history once rolled by in a blur of rain, diesel, and resolve. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had become a legend, proof that in war, ingenuity often wins where planning fails. The drivers may have been ordinary men, but they carried the extraordinary weight of an army's hope. And through mud, exhaustion, and fear they delivered. The Red Ball Express was never meant to be remembered. It was supposed to be temporary, an emergency measure, a stopgap until ports opened and rails were rebuilt. Yet its story endures, because it revealed something timeless about war. That victory isn't only forged in battle, but in motion, in the unseen rhythm of supply, sweat, and sheer will. When we think of the great offensives of 1944, the breakout from Normandy, the race across France, the liberation of Paris, we often picture tanks, soldiers, and flags. But beneath all of that was the sound of engines, thousands of them, humming through the night. That sound was the Red Ball Express. It was the pulse that kept the Western Front alive. The living proof that logistics, the dull, dirty, grinding machinery of war, can become something heroic. The drivers were not strategists or generals. They were young men with cracked hands and sleepless eyes, trusting a compass, a convoy, and a single purpose: keep moving. They faced no glory, no medals, no easy path home. But their resolve built the bridge between victory and defeat, 1 mile at a time. The ridiculous method that saved the Express reminds us that innovation is often born in desperation, that even in chaos, one idea, one moment of human clarity, can turn the tide of history. And in that idea lies the quiet truth of the Red Ball Express. That courage isn't only found in charging forward. Sometimes it's found in simply not stopping. Because on those dark French roads, through rain and gunfire, thousands of drivers proved that the will to keep going, when everything says stop, can carry the weight of a war. And long after the roads faded and the engines went silent, that will still moves through history, like the low hum of a convoy on a night that never ends.